Today we're going to explore one of the darkest and most disturbing legends that surround the majestic fortifications of the Middle Ages, a theme that blends myth, superstition, and reality in a way that is almost indistinguishable. When we look at the medieval castles that still dot the European landscape, it is hard not to feel a sense of awe at their architectural grandeur and their ability to withstand the test of time. Imposing walls, towers that reach toward the sky, and foundations that seem indestructible make us wonder how these monumental structures were built more than 800 years ago and still stand today. But behind this grandeur lies a much darker narrative, a story that combines ancestral beliefs, superstitious practices, and brutal working conditions that turned castle construction into one of the most dangerous and deadly undertakings in human history. The idea that workers were deliberately buried alive in the foundations of castles, bridges, and cathedrals is one of the most persistent medieval urban legends. And although it may seem like just a horror tale invented to frighten children, the truth is that this practice, known as foundational sacrifice, had deep roots in religious and spiritual beliefs that date back to civilizations long before the Middle Ages. To fully understand this macabre practice, we need to dive not only into the stories and legends that have survived through the centuries, but also examine the archaeological evidence that has been uncovered, the actual working conditions of medieval builders, and how the line between myth and reality often becomes blurred when we talk about times so distant. Before we continue our journey through this fascinating and disturbing topic, if you enjoy exploring the darker aspects of human history and want to discover more surprising truths about the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, prepare yourself for a deep exploration that goes far beyond the romantic appearances of medieval castles, revealing the brutal practices, superstitious beliefs, and real human costs that lay behind every stone placed in these monumental structures. The concept of foundational sacrifice is not exclusive to medieval Europe, but has roots that stretch through practically all ancient civilizations of the world, from Mesopotamia to the pre-Columbian cultures of the Americas. The central idea behind this practice was simple, yet deeply rooted in the mystical thinking of the time. Building a permanent structure on the land was seen as an affront to the spirits and deities that inhabited that place. To appease these supernatural beings and ensure that the construction remained standing, it was believed that a human sacrifice was necessary, and this sacrifice often took the form of burying a person alive in the foundations of the building. The technical term used by archaeologists to describe this practice is precisely foundational sacrifice, which refers to the act of burying a human being beneath, within, or upon the foundations of buildings during or immediately after construction. The logic behind this practice was grounded in the belief that the sacrificial victim would be transformed into a spiritual guardian of the building, their soul eternally bound to the structure, protecting it from collapse, invasions, and other calamities. Historical records and archaeological discoveries confirm that this practice was not just a rural superstition, but something that occurred in various advanced cultures throughout history. In ancient Rome, for example, there are documented records of human sacrifices carried out in the Forum Boarium, where pairs of Gauls and Greeks were buried alive in a stone chamber as an appeal to the gods to save Rome from destruction during the Punic Wars, specifically after the devastating defeat at Cannae in 216 BC. The Roman historian Livy described these sacrifices in his writings, although he tried to distance the practice from Roman tradition itself, claiming that such acts were completely alien to the Roman spirit. Curiously, the same ritual was apparently repeated in 113 BC in preparation for an invasion from Gaul, demonstrating that even in a civilization as advanced as Rome, belief in the power of human sacrifice persisted in times of great crisis. In medieval Europe, the legends about foundational sacrifices are deeply intertwined with the construction of castles, bridges, cathedrals, and monasteries, and many of these stories survived through folklore and popular ballads that were passed down orally for generations before finally being written down. One of the most famous legends is that of Rosafa Castle in Albania, a story that perfectly encapsulates the tragic and disturbing nature of foundational sacrifice. The legend tells that 3 brothers were working on building the walls of a mighty fortress. But every night at midnight, the ground would shake and send the newly placed stones rolling to the ground, undoing all the work of the previous day. Desperate and confused, the brothers were approached by an old man who revealed the reason for their difficulties. The spirit of the castle demanded a human life as a sacrifice. But the sacrifice could not be just anyone. It had to be someone beloved by the builders themselves, someone whose sacrifice truly meant something and had enough spiritual weight to satisfy the supernatural forces. The 3 brothers then made a dark pact. When their wives came to bring lunch the next day, the one who arrived first would be seized and walled up in the stones of the castle. They swore to one another that they would not warn their wives, so that the selection would truly be the work of fate. But that night in bed, the eldest brother whispered the secret to his wife, and the second brother did the same. Only the youngest brother remained faithful to his oath. The next day, only Rosafa, the youngest brother's wife, arrived alone to bring lunch. The brothers grabbed her and began to wall her up alive in the foundations of the castle, leaving just a single stone's width of opening so that she could nurse her baby through the gap. This story, although clearly a legend, reflects very real beliefs that existed in the medieval period about the need for human sacrifices to guarantee the stability of large architectural structures. British legends are also full of references to foundational sacrifices, particularly the stories of Dinas Emrys and Saint Oran of Iona, both of which mention that people were ritually killed and buried beneath the foundations of important constructions. In Welsh tradition, the legend of Dinas Emrys involves King Vortigern trying to build a fortress that repeatedly collapsed during construction, until his advisors suggested that a human sacrifice was necessary. In Scotland, the story of Saint Oran tells that he voluntarily offered himself to be buried alive in the foundations of a chapel on the sacred island of Iona, believing that his sacrifice would guarantee the permanence of the religious structure. These legends, although they may contain fictional elements accumulated over centuries of oral transmission, are regarded by historians as reflections of real practices and beliefs that existed during the medieval period. The central question that historians and archaeologists face is to what extent these legends are based on real events versus being purely allegorical or moralizing. The answer, as we will see, is complex and nuanced, involving both concrete archaeological evidence and an understanding of the cultural and religious context of the time. Archaeological evidence for foundational sacrifices varies significantly in terms of clarity and interpretation, but there are documented discoveries that strongly suggest that the practice did indeed occur in some cases. Excavations in Palestine, for example, have brought to light human skeletons found in the foundation stones of ancient walls, discoveries that were documented by archaeologists such as Schumacher in his description of Tel el Muteselem, the site of biblical Megiddo where the famous battle took place. These skeletons were positioned in ways that strongly suggested they had been deliberately placed there during construction, not simply buried later. In Europe, similar discoveries have been made in various locations. In 1912, workers who were restoring an old Romanian monastery discovered a human skeleton inside the walls, believed to be an immured sacrifice from the 16th century. The English castle of St. Briavels, dating from the 17th century, revealed during restoration work a skeleton walled up, thought to be that of a heretic who had been imprisoned and left to die inside the wall. Strasbourg Cathedral, according to historical documents, is said to have required the sacrifice of 2 human lives, and old records claim that 2 brothers lie buried in its foundations. These discoveries present a major interpretive challenge for archaeologists, because it is not always possible to determine with absolute certainty whether a person was deliberately buried alive as a sacrifice or was the victim of a construction accident, or even buried after death for reasons unrelated to foundational sacrifices. The practice of immurement, or walling up, which is closely related to the concept of foundational sacrifice, took several forms in medieval Europe, and had multiple motivations beyond purely superstitious ones. Immurement was the act of sealing a living person inside a structure, whether a wall, a tower, or a specially built chamber, and leaving them to die slowly from hunger, dehydration, or asphyxiation. The most shocking cases were those involving nuns and maidens condemned for breaking vows of chastity, and, surprisingly, architects who were supposedly entombed alive within their own structures as offerings to guarantee the building's longevity. The reasons behind the practice of immurement were varied and reflected different aspects of medieval society. As a religious penalty, the Church sometimes condemned transgressive nuns to immurement for breaking their vows, enclosing them within the walls of the monastery, where they faced a slow death by starvation or suffocation, with only the whisper of their own prayers for company. As an architectural superstition, legends tell that builders immured humans, often children or virgins, within the foundations of castles and bridges to guarantee their strength and stability. The chilling belief was that a sacrificed soul would prevent the structure from collapsing, turning the victim's spirit into an eternal guardian of the building. As a method of political execution, royalty and noble families used immurement to quietly eliminate rivals, ensuring a slow and hidden death that created no martyrs and left no graves to visit, only forgotten bones behind a wall. As punishment for adultery and heresy, adulterous wives, treacherous advisers, and heretics were sometimes subjected to this fate, left to wither away behind stone and mortar. The specific legends of immurement that have survived through the centuries are particularly disturbing and show how these practices captured the popular imagination and became part of European folklore. The legend of the walled-up nun appears in several versions across Europe, telling the story of a nun who broke her vows and was walled up alive inside the walls of her convent, and whose ghost is said to wander the corridors, weeping in eternal remorse. The legend of the master builder and the curse, particularly associated with Curtea de Argeș monastery in Romania, tells the story of a master builder who made a pact with dark forces. To ensure the completion of his monastery, he was forced to immure his own wife within the walls, and her laments are said to still be heard on stormy nights. The Black Bride of the Tower, a legend from medieval Germany, speaks of a noblewoman accused of treason who was walled up in a room in the tower, and years later her skeletal remains were found with fingers worn down to the bone from scratching the walls in a desperate attempt to escape. These stories, although likely embellished over time, often had a kernel of truth, reflecting real practices that occurred in medieval society, even if the specific details may have diverged from historical reality. But beyond the deliberate practices of foundational sacrifice and immurement as punishment, there was a much more prosaic and equally grim reality related to castle construction in the Middle Ages. The brutal working conditions and constant dangers that made castle building one of the deadliest professions of the time. Medieval construction was a monumentally dangerous undertaking that regularly claimed lives through accidents, collapses, and extremely precarious working conditions. To truly understand how many people died in the construction of castles, we need to look not only at the legends of foundational sacrifices, but also at the brutal reality of medieval construction work itself. The construction of a medieval castle was an extremely complex and time-consuming process that often took decades to complete and involved hundreds or even thousands of workers at different stages. The first step was to level and clear the site, then mark out the size and shape of the building using wooden stakes and ropes. The foundation trenches were then dug, an extremely dangerous process that involved excavating deep into the ground without any modern safety supports, constantly risking collapses that could bury workers alive. The trenches were first filled with a mixture of rubble and mortar, then retaining walls were built on top up to just below ground level, and the space between them was filled with more rubble and mortar. This foundation process was critical to the stability of the entire structure, and any mistake or collapse at this early stage could result in the immediate deaths of workers buried under tons of earth and stone. The quarrying and transport of stone were other extremely dangerous aspects of castle construction that resulted in countless deaths and serious injuries. If possible, A quarry would be established as close as possible to the construction site to minimize the costs and difficulties of transport. Working in a medieval quarry was incredibly dangerous, involving the extraction of huge stone blocks using primitive techniques that often resulted in fatal accidents when blocks fell on workers or when quarry walls collapsed. If a quarry could not be established nearby, the master builder had to obtain the required stone from independent quarry masters, and transport then became a monumental logistical problem. Since road transport was slow, complicated, and extremely expensive, the ideal way to transport stone to the site was to use rivers and waterways whenever possible. Transport was one of the largest sources of expense in castle construction, but it was also a significant source of accidents and deaths, with carts overturning, boats sinking, and workers being crushed by loads that broke loose during transport. The types of stone used in castle construction varied by region and availability, including limestone, which was valued for its workability but relatively soft, granite, which was harder to shape but incredibly durable, and sandstone, which offered distinctive color and texture. Each type of stone presented its own unique challenges and dangers for the workers who quarried, transported, and shaped it. The preparation of mortar for the walls was a time-consuming and technically complex process that also posed significant risks to workers. Mortar was prepared by burning limestone or chalk in kilns to produce quicklime, an extremely dangerous process because quicklime is highly caustic and can cause severe burns on contact with skin or eyes. This quicklime was then mixed with water to produce lime putty, to which sand was added. This mixture was then turned into mortar with the help of a mechanical mixer consisting of a circular pit with a central vertical post to which a horizontal beam with paddles was attached. When the beam was turned, the paddles stirred the mixture, turning it into usable mortar. Workers handling quicklime regularly suffered severe chemical burns, and inhalation of fumes during the burning process could cause permanent respiratory damage. Lime mortar was extremely time-consuming to work with because it takes a long time to cure, sometimes up to a week, and for this reason only a limited section of wall could be built at a time before workers had to wait for the mortar to harden. If construction continued before the mortar had cured, the weight of the walls would push the mortar out and there would be very little holding the wall together, resulting in catastrophic collapses that could kill dozens of workers at once. Even today, if you go into the very center of a castle wall built 800 years ago, you may find that the lime mortar still has not completely hardened, demonstrating how gradual the process was. Lime mortar also required specific weather conditions, making medieval construction highly seasonal and dependent on the climate. If it was raining or damp, the mortar could be washed out or take longer to cure. And if it was too hot, the stones in the wall had to be kept moist to prevent them from absorbing the moisture from the mortar and stopping it from bonding properly. Construction in the medieval period was often seasonal, with building work carried out during the 6 months of the year when the weather was most favorable for outdoor labor. Lime mortar has an extremely slow curing time, which made it vulnerable to being washed away in bad weather. The slow curing time also meant that the height of construction in a single day was limited, because upper levels could not be laid until the mortar below had dried, providing a stable base to work on. This dependence on weather conditions meant that workers often faced periods of forced unemployment during the winter months, resulting in economic hardship, while during the building season they were pressured to work long hours in extremely dangerous conditions to maximize progress before the weather changed again. The dangers of working at heights during castle construction were perhaps the most obvious and deadly of all the risks medieval workers faced. As the walls and towers of a castle rose, workers had to operate on primitive wooden scaffolding that was inherently unstable and prone to collapse. This scaffolding was built using ropes, wooden beams, and planks, without any modern safety standards or protective equipment. Falls from great heights were extremely common and almost always fatal, or they resulted in permanent disabling injuries. In addition, tools, stones, and other building materials regularly fell from the upper levels, hitting workers below and causing serious injuries or instant death. There were no safety helmets, nets, harnesses, or any other kind of personal protective equipment that we consider basic today. Workers simply had to rely on their skill, luck, and prayers to survive each day working at the perilous heights of castle construction. A tragic and very recent example of how dangerous the construction and restoration of medieval structures can be occurred in November 2025, when the Torre dei Conti, a medieval tower near the Colosseum in Rome, partially collapsed during restoration work. On the morning of November 3rd, 2025, parts of the 13th century tower collapsed in 2 stages over 90 minutes, killing 1 person and injuring several others. The man who later died, Octav Stroici, 66 years old, from Romania, succumbed to his injuries after being trapped under the rubble for more than 11 hours before firefighters managed to rescue him. He went into cardiac arrest and died shortly after arriving at the hospital. His wife was present at the site when the incident occurred, making the tragedy even more devastating. Another Romanian worker suffered minor injuries. Both men were employed on the conservation project funded by the European Union. The tower was undergoing extensive renovations financed by the European Union when the collapse occurred. The heavy debris and dust in the air made the rescue operation extremely difficult, and the structure of the tower also hindered the rescue of those trapped, as additional rubble continued to fall during the operation. Witnesses, including a crowd of nearby tourists who filmed the event as it happened, reported that it felt like an earthquake, with the ground shaking as the debris fell. Several workers were reportedly inside the site when the collapse occurred, though the exact cause of the failure remains unknown. The case remains under investigation, with new charges of involuntary manslaughter being considered in connection with the worker's death and ongoing concerns about safety practices at the site. This tragic and contemporary incident shows that even with all our modern technological advances, safety equipment, and regulations, working on medieval structures remains extremely dangerous. Imagine, then, how much more dangerous it was during the original construction of these structures, when there were absolutely none of the safety standards, protective equipment, or rescue procedures we have today. The reality of medieval construction was that fatal accidents were so common they were simply accepted as an inevitable part of the building process, something that master builders and project financiers factored into their planning. There was no workers' compensation, life insurance, or support systems for the families of workers who were killed or injured. If a worker died on site, his body was simply removed and another worker was hired to replace him. In some cases, depending on the superstitious beliefs of the time and place, a body might deliberately be left in the foundations or walls as an accidental foundational sacrifice that became intentional, turning a construction fatality into a spiritual offering to ensure the structure's stability. This is one of the reasons why it is so difficult for archaeologists to distinguish between deliberate foundational sacrifices and victims of construction accidents who were simply left where they fell. Excavations in Vienna recently discovered a medieval mass grave near the historic Baton Castle, containing the remains of multiple individuals who may have been victims of construction accidents, epidemics, or even sacrifices. But determining the exact cause of death and the circumstances of the burial is extremely challenging after so many centuries. The question of how many workers actually died in the construction of medieval castles is impossible to answer accurately because there are no comprehensive records of worker deaths from the period. The lives of ordinary workers simply were not considered important enough to be meticulously documented. What we do know is that the construction of a single large castle could take decades and employ thousands of workers over its course. Given the extremely dangerous working conditions, the lack of safety equipment, the constant risks of falls, collapses, accidents with tools and heavy materials, and the physically exhausting nature of the labor itself, it is reasonable to estimate that a significant percentage of the workforce would suffer serious or fatal injuries over the course of a castle construction project. If we consider that a major castle project might employ 1,000 workers over 20 years, and if only 1% of them died in work-related accidents each year, an extremely conservative estimate given the conditions. That would result in about 200 deaths for the construction of a single castle. Multiply that by the thousands of castles built across Europe during the Middle Ages, and the total number of deaths easily reaches tens or even hundreds of thousands of workers who perished to create the structures we admire today. But returning to the specific issue of deliberate foundational sacrifices versus accidental deaths, it is important to understand how historians and archaeologists attempt to distinguish between these two scenarios when analyzing archaeological finds. When human remains are found in the foundations of ancient buildings, several factors are examined to determine the nature of the death and the burial. The position and orientation of the skeleton can provide clues. A body carefully positioned in a specific posture, especially in architecturally significant locations such as beneath cornerstones or main pillars, suggests an intentional burial that may have been a foundational sacrifice. The presence or absence of obvious trauma on the skeleton is also informative. Signs of violence before death may indicate sacrifice, while injuries consistent with falls or being crushed by heavy objects suggest construction accidents. The presence of objects buried with the body or evidence of rituals can also indicate a deliberate and potentially sacrificial burial. However, these distinctions are often unclear, especially when time has significantly degraded the remains and the archaeological context. An additional complication in interpreting archaeological discoveries is that not all foundational sacrifices involved real human victims, and there was a wide variety of substitute practices that developed over time. As social and religious attitudes changed, particularly with the growing influence of Christianity in Europe, the practice of sacrificing real humans became increasingly unacceptable, but the superstitious belief in the need for some kind of foundational offering persisted. This led to the development of symbolic or substitute sacrifices, in which animals, objects, or representations were used in place of real human victims. Archaeological evidence in Britain, for example, shows that objects deposited were often coins or shoes and boots, frequently found in archaeological deposits associated with building foundations. Occasionally, these items were placed in the wall of a structure near the chimney. In distant but related locations, archaeologists have discovered similar objects associated with the remains of structures in the Virginia City National Historic Landmark District in Nevada, including altered coins, the skeleton of a small animal, a boot, and other items that represent a tradition that was implemented secretly. It is likely that the caustic content of mortar dissolved many of the animal's delicate bones, leaving remains too decomposed to identify, but it appears to have belonged to a cat or a dog. The placement of an animal or its remains beneath a building's foundation is a widespread practice, typically intended to confer a level of protection on those within the structure. The burial of empty coffins beneath the foundations of buildings was another form of symbolic foundational sacrifice documented in several European regions. This empty coffin symbolically represented a human body and presumably fulfilled the same spiritual function that a real human sacrifice would have, but without the moral and practical cost of actually killing someone. Other common items used as sacrificial substitutes included eggs, books, candles, bottles of wine, and even decks of cards, each presumably having some symbolic or spiritual meaning, believed to provide protection or good fortune to the structure. The transition from real human sacrifices to symbolic substitutes likely occurred gradually over centuries and varied significantly between different regions and cultural contexts. In areas where Christianity was stronger and more firmly established, the practice of human sacrifice would have disappeared earlier and been more fully replaced by symbolic alternatives. In more remote regions, or where ancient pagan beliefs persisted longer, more literal practices may have continued for a longer time. It is crucial to understand that the medieval Catholic Church officially condemned any form of human sacrifice as an abominable pagan practice, and anyone discovered performing such acts would be subject to severe punishment, including possibly execution for heresy. However, this does not necessarily mean that such practices did not occur at all. but rather that they would have been carried out secretly and by the most superstitious and least educated strata of society. It is possible and even likely that there was a significant disconnect between the Church's official doctrines and the popular religious practices actually followed by common people in villages and the countryside. Ancient pagan beliefs often persisted beneath a thin layer of Christianity, particularly in rural regions where ecclesiastical authority had limited reach. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, the line between deliberate foundational sacrifices and simply leaving the bodies of accident victims where they fell may have been quite thin, with later superstitions retrospectively transforming accidental tragedies into narratives of intentional sacrifices. The practice of immurement that we discussed earlier existed in a separate but related category, because while some cases of immurement were clearly legal or religious punishments for specific crimes, other cases seem to have been more clearly related to beliefs about architectural sacrifices. Legends about architects being immured in their own creations, for example, seem rooted in the idea that the sacrifice of the creator would give the structure special strength and permanence. There was also a tradition of anchoritism, in which religious individuals voluntarily chose to be immured in small cells attached to churches, where they would spend the rest of their lives in prayer and isolation. Although technically not sacrifices in the sense of being killed, these anchorites were effectively buried alive, and their cells often became their literal tombs. The interior of an anchoritic cell was sparse, and several documents mention a grave dug into the floor. The anchorite would lie in this grave when being immured, and it became their tomb after death. A table, a stool, and a few devotional objects completed their possessions. Some anchoritic cells were larger, with 2 or 3 rooms on 2 floors, but most were small and poorly furnished. Devout anchorites lived in an unheated cell, but excavations have shown that most had built-in chimneys. During the Middle Ages, thousands of women and men chose to be immured alive in this way, motivated by extreme religious devotion. This practice of voluntary anchoritism shows that the idea of being immured alive was not universally seen as a horrific punishment, but in certain religious contexts it was viewed as an act of supreme devotion and spiritual sacrifice. This adds another layer of complexity to our understanding of immurement practices in medieval Europe, because it suggests that attitudes toward being sealed alive in a structure were more nuanced and culturally contingent than we might first imagine. For a devout Christian anchorite, being immured was seen as a way of dying to the world and living entirely for God, an extreme form of asceticism that was admired and revered by medieval society. For a foundational sacrifice victim or a person being punished for crimes, the experience would obviously be completely different, marked by terror, despair, and suffering. But the existence of the anchoritic tradition shows that the very idea and practice of immurement were part of the medieval cultural fabric in ways that are difficult for us, with our modern sensitivities, to fully comprehend. The central moral that runs through many foundational sacrifice legends is the idea that a meaningful sacrifice is necessary to guarantee the stability and longevity of a major construction project. This belief reflects a pre-modern worldview in which supernatural forces were believed to influence the physical world in direct and powerful ways. The immurement of a human being, often a wife, as in the Razafa legend, was seen as a way to appease these forces and imbue the structure with a foundational sacrifice. But beyond the supernatural dimension, these legends can also be interpreted as metaphorical acknowledgements of the real human costs of monumental construction. When we consider how many workers actually died in accidents during the construction of castles, bridges, and cathedrals, the legends of people being buried in the foundations take on an additional resonance, not as literal descriptions of ritual sacrifices, but as symbolic acknowledgements that these structures were literally built upon the bodies and with the blood of countless workers who perished in the process. This more metaphorical interpretation does not exclude the possibility that some literal foundational sacrifices did occur, especially in earlier periods or in specific cultural contexts where such practices were more acceptable. but it suggests that the persistence and ubiquity of these legends across Europe may have as much to do with cultural recognition of the real human costs of monumental construction as with literal sacrificial practices. In other words, even if deliberate, ritual foundational sacrifices were relatively rare or confined to specific contexts, the brutal reality was that castles were literally built with human lives, whether through ritual sacrifices or, far more commonly, through the countless fatal accidents that regularly occurred during these massive and dangerous construction projects. An additional perspective on this issue comes from considering who the workers who built these castles were, and what their place was in medieval society. The vast majority of construction workers were peasants and serfs, people at the lowest level of the feudal hierarchy who had very little power or autonomy over their own lives. In many cases, workers were compulsorily recruited by feudal lords to work on castle construction projects, essentially as a form of labour tax. These workers had no choice about whether to participate, and certainly had no voice in matters of safety or working conditions. For the medieval ruling classes who funded and oversaw these projects, the lives of individual workers simply did not have much value. They were seen as disposable resources, not very different from the building materials themselves. This fundamental devaluation of the human lives of ordinary workers created an environment in which both deliberate foundational sacrifices and simple fatal negligence of working conditions became possible. If a peasant's life had no intrinsic value beyond their usefulness to the nobility, then burying one alive in a castle's foundations for superstitious reasons, or simply allowing workers to die in preventable accidents, would not have seemed particularly problematic to those in power. The time scale involved in the construction of medieval castles is also important for understanding the potential numbers of deaths involved. While some smaller castles could be completed in a few years, large castle projects often extended over decades or even generations. The famous Windsor Castle in England, for example, was begun by William the Conqueror in 1070 and underwent continuous expansions and modifications for centuries afterward. The construction of Cologne Cathedral in Germany took more than 600 years from start to finish, albeit with many interruptions. Even more modest projects often took 20 to 30 years to complete. During these long time spans, generations of workers would dedicate their entire lives to these projects, many never seeing the completion of the building they had worked on for years or decades. Over the course of such lengthy construction periods, accidental deaths would occur regularly, year after year, until the total number of workers who perished on a single castle project could easily reach the hundreds. In addition to the direct physical dangers of construction, medieval workers also faced significant health threats due to unhealthy living and working conditions. Building sites were often dirty and overcrowded places where disease spread quickly. During epidemics like the Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, construction worker communities were particularly vulnerable due to their close living conditions. Malnutrition was common among workers, who often received inadequate diets that left them physically weak and more susceptible to injuries and illnesses. The physically exhausting work of hauling heavy stones, digging foundations, and working on scaffolding for long hours day after day led to extreme bodily wear and repetitive strain injuries that could permanently disable workers. Even those who survived without fatal accidents often ended their lives with broken bodies, damaged joints, and significantly reduced life expectancy due to the rigors of medieval construction work. The tools and techniques available to medieval builders also contributed significantly to the dangers of the job. Although medieval master builders were incredibly skilled and developed ingenious techniques to handle the challenges of constructing large stone structures, they were fundamentally limited by the technology available at the time. Stones had to be cut and shaped manually using chisels, hammers, and saws, an extremely labor-intensive and dangerous process. Hoisting large stone blocks to the ever-increasing heights of castle walls required elaborate systems of pulleys and wooden cranes that were prone to catastrophic failure. These lifting devices relied on human or animal power for operation, and if a rope snapped or a mechanism failed, multi-ton stone blocks could fall, crushing any unfortunate worker below. The precision required to fit stones into their correct positions demanded that workers place themselves in precarious positions at the edges of walls and on unstable scaffolding, constantly risking fatal falls. The organisation of labour on medieval construction projects also reflected and reinforced the dangerous nature of the occupation. Master builders and skilled masons occupied the top of the hierarchy, with less skilled workers carrying out the most dangerous and physically demanding tasks. This division of labour meant that those with less experience and training were often placed in the riskiest situations, further increasing the likelihood of fatal accidents. The apprenticeship system through which skilled builders were trained was long and rigorous. But it also meant that young apprentices were constantly exposed to dangers before they had fully developed the skills and judgment needed to work safely. Many apprentices did not survive to become master craftsmen, their lives cut short by accidents that were simply accepted as inevitable occupational risks. The financing and economics of castle construction projects also significantly influenced safety levels and mortality rates among workers. Building a castle was an extraordinarily expensive endeavour that could drain the treasuries of even the wealthiest nobles. Costs included not only materials and labour, but also the transport of stone from distant quarries, the maintenance of large workforces for years or decades, and the associated costs of feeding and housing workers. Under financial pressure, there were strong incentives to cut costs wherever possible, and one of the easiest ways to reduce expenses was to skimp on safety measures that were rudimentary by modern standards, in any case. Scaffolding might be built using cheaper, less stable wood, lifting equipment might be used beyond its safe lifespan, and workers might be pressured to work faster and take greater risks to speed up construction and reduce total labour costs. These economic decisions translated directly into higher mortality rates among workers. The issue of responsibility and accountability for worker deaths on medieval construction projects is particularly revealing of the era's attitudes toward the lives of ordinary workers. Unlike modern society, where fatal workplace accidents trigger investigations, possible lawsuits, and changes in safety regulations, the Middle Ages had no such mechanisms. There were no safety inspections, labour regulations, or government agencies overseeing working conditions. If a worker died in a construction accident, responsibility was rarely, if ever, attributed to the project's financiers or the master builders overseeing the work. The death was simply recorded, if it was recorded at all, and another worker was found to take the deceased's place. The families of deceased workers generally received no compensation and often faced severe economic hardship with the loss of the family provider. This lack of accountability created an environment where there were few incentives to improve safety conditions or protect workers' lives, perpetuating the high mortality rates that characterized medieval construction projects. The religious and spiritual beliefs of the medieval period also shaped how worker deaths were understood and processed by society. In an era when death was omnipresent due to disease, wars, famines, and other calamities, there was a certain fatalistic acceptance of mortality that extended to construction work. Many people believed that the time and circumstances of a person's death were predetermined by God, a belief that could turn fatal construction accidents into expressions of divine will rather than preventable safety failures. Prayers and religious rituals performed at the beginning of construction projects and at various stages during building were intended not only to ensure the structural success of the building, but also to protect workers from harm. When fatal accidents occurred despite these spiritual precautions, it could be interpreted as a sign that God had called the victim's soul home, rather than as a failure of adequate safety measures. This religious framework for understanding worker deaths provided comfort to grieving families, but also served to absolve those responsible for the construction projects of guilt or responsibility for the deaths that occurred under their supervision. The intersection between foundational sacrifice practices and accidental worker deaths becomes even more complex when we consider how folklore and legend developed around specific construction sites over time. When a particularly impressive castle remained standing for centuries, seemingly defying time and the elements, while other nearby structures crumbled, people naturally sought explanations for such exceptional durability. Stories of foundational sacrifices could arise retrospectively as attempts to explain why certain buildings were so enduring, attributing their stability to special rituals or sacrifices performed during their construction. Similarly, if a worker died under particularly memorable or tragic circumstances during the construction of a notable building, that death could be incorporated into the legend and tradition surrounding the structure, potentially transforming an accident into a deliberate sacrifice in the retelling. This narrative evolution makes it extremely difficult for historians and archaeologists to separate the historical core of these legends from the fictional embellishments added over centuries of oral transmission. Comparisons between different regions of Europe reveal interesting variations in both foundational sacrifice legends and the realities of medieval construction safety. In regions with strong common law traditions and growing artisan guild institutions, such as parts of England and the Low Countries, there were more robust attempts to regulate construction work and protect craftsmen's rights, which may have resulted in slightly safer conditions and somewhat lower mortality rates. By contrast, in more remote regions or where feudal power was more absolute and less tempered by emerging worker rights institutions, conditions were likely even more brutal and mortality rates even higher. Similarly, foundational sacrifice legends seem to be more prevalent and elaborate in regions where pre-Christian pagan traditions persisted longer, or where there was greater syncretism between Christian beliefs and older spiritual practices. Written documentation that has survived from the Middle Ages rarely provides detailed accounts of construction accidents or foundational sacrifice practices, partly because literacy was limited and written records tended to focus on matters considered more important by the literate elite, such as political, diplomatic, and ecclesiastical affairs. However, occasional records in monastic chronicles, building accounts, and legal documents offer glimpses into the realities of medieval construction work. Some building records list payments to the families of dead workers, suggesting that at least in some cases there was some recognition of responsibility toward those who perished on construction projects. Other references mention special prayers or masses performed after fatal accidents, indicating that such events were noted and ritually marked, even if there were no systematic changes to safety practices. The psychological legacy of the brutal conditions of medieval construction and the legends of foundational sacrifices continues to resonate in contemporary popular culture. Ghost stories associated with ancient castles often incorporate narratives of workers who died during construction and whose spirits are said to haunt the sites. These ghost stories can be seen as modern continuations of medieval beliefs that the souls of the dead remained attached to the buildings where they perished. The ongoing fascination with foundational sacrifice legends in books, films, and popular media shows that these stories continue to capture our imagination and serve as disturbing reminders of the human costs of monumental construction. From the perspective of cultural anthropology and social psychology, foundational sacrifice legends can serve multiple functions beyond simply recording real historical practices. They function as cautionary narratives about human hubris and the dangers of challenging natural or supernatural forces through overly ambitious enterprises. They provide culturally meaningful explanations for why certain buildings remain standing for centuries while others collapse, attributing exceptional durability to supernatural causes rather than simply acknowledging variations in construction quality and environmental conditions. They also serve as collective acknowledgements of the real human costs of major construction projects, transforming the anonymized suffering of countless workers into specific, memorable narratives that can be passed down through generations. The comparison between European foundational sacrifice legends and similar practices documented in other cultures around the world reveals interesting patterns. In many ancient civilizations, from China to pre-Columbian Americas, there is archaeological evidence of human sacrifices associated with major construction projects. In ancient China, for example, Excavations have revealed human remains buried in the foundations of walls and palaces, with evidence suggesting that these people were deliberately killed as part of construction rituals. At Shimao, a Chinese archaeological site over 4,300 years old, archaeologists discovered 80 severed heads in pits beneath the city walls, all belonging to teenage girls who may have been sacrificed during foundation ceremonies. In Mesoamerican cultures, including the Aztecs and the Maya, human sacrifices were an integral part of construction rituals for temples and pyramids, with victims buried in foundations or killed atop newly completed structures. This global distribution of foundational sacrifice practices suggests that there may be deep human psychological patterns underlying these traditions. In many cultures, there is a fundamental belief that building permanent structures disrupts the natural or spiritual order and requires some form of compensation or appeasement. The offering of human life, the most valuable sacrifice in most human value systems, serves as a way to pay this spiritual debt and ensure that the structure is accepted by the forces governing the world. This cross-cultural perspective suggests that European foundational sacrifice legends were not merely local cultural quirks, but reflections of more universal human beliefs about the relationship between construction, sacrifice, and structural stability. However, it is crucial to distinguish between cultures where foundational sacrifices were officially sanctioned and regularly practiced, as in some Mesoamerican societies, and cultures like medieval Christian Europe, where such practices were officially prohibited, but may have persisted secretly in some contexts or existed primarily as legends and folklore. Archaeological evidence for literal foundational sacrifices in medieval Europe is far more ambiguous and controversial than the evidence from other regions of the world, where the practice was more openly and systematically carried out. This does not mean that European legends lack historical significance, but rather that their significance may lie as much in revealing cultural attitudes and anxieties as in documenting literal practices. The modern profession of archaeology continues to discover new sites and reinterpret old finds, potentially shedding new light on the question of medieval foundational sacrifices. Advances in forensic techniques allow for more detailed analyses of ancient human remains, potentially revealing information about cause of death, diet, health, and geographic origin that can help distinguish between deliberate sacrifices, accident victims, and conventional burials that happen to occur near building foundations. Radiocarbon dating can more precisely establish whether human remains found in foundations are contemporary with the original construction or were buried at some later time. DNA analysis can reveal family relationships between multiple victims found at the same site, potentially providing clues as to whether the deaths resulted from single catastrophic events, such as construction collapses, or from more systematic sacrificial practices. As our understanding of medieval construction becomes more sophisticated through experimental archaeology and analysis of existing buildings, we also gain a deeper appreciation of the incredible technical challenges that medieval builders faced. Modern experiments attempting to replicate medieval construction techniques using period tools and methods demonstrate how physically demanding and dangerous this work was. These experimental studies validate the conclusion that mortality rates among medieval construction workers must have been very high, even without invoking deliberate sacrifices. They also demonstrate the remarkable skill and ingenuity of medieval master builders who were able to create such impressive and durable structures despite limited technological resources. The cultural and psychological impact of working on construction projects where death was a constant possibility cannot be underestimated. Medieval workers, who devoted their lives to building castles, cathedrals, and bridges, lived with the daily awareness that any workday could be their last. This constant proximity to death likely shaped their religious perspectives, their family and community structures, and their sense of purpose and meaning. For many medieval workers, construction work may have been understood not only as a way to earn a living, but as a form of service to God, with the risks and sacrifices being part of a larger spiritual vocation. This perspective may help explain why workers continued to volunteer for construction projects despite the known dangers. The relationship between foundational sacrifices, accidental worker deaths, and the actual durability of medieval buildings also deserves consideration. From the perspective of modern engineering, we know that a building's structural stability depends on factors such as material quality, soundness of design, solidity of foundations, and careful execution of construction, not on any spiritual or supernatural sacrifices. However, there may be indirect connections between ritual practices and construction quality. If elaborate foundational rituals, possibly including sacrifices, were performed, this likely signaled that the project was considered extremely important, which could translate into greater resources being allocated, better craftsmen being employed, and more care being taken in all aspects of construction. In other words, buildings considered important enough to merit foundational sacrifices were probably also those that received the highest level of craftsmanship and material resources, which could explain their exceptional durability through entirely natural means. The question of how and when foundational sacrifice practices, if they existed at all in medieval Europe, finally disappeared completely is fascinating. The process was likely gradual and uneven, with different regions and social contexts abandoning such practices at different times. The growing dominance of institutional Christianity and the expansion of ecclesiastical authority into previously remote regions would have made it increasingly difficult to carry out such rituals in secret. The development of a more scientific understanding of engineering and architecture during the Renaissance, and especially the Enlightenment, would have undermined the intellectual basis for believing that supernatural sacrifices were necessary for structural stability. At the same time, gradual improvements in working conditions and in the valuation of human life, however limited by modern standards, would have made any form of deliberate human sacrifice increasingly socially unacceptable. However, as we saw earlier, elements of foundational sacrifice beliefs persisted in transformed forms until quite recent times. The practice of burying time capsules, cornerstones, or other symbolic objects during groundbreaking ceremonies can be seen as a secular continuation of foundational sacrifice traditions. Although they no longer involve real human or animal victims, these modern practices still reflect the same fundamental belief that something of value must be consecrated within a building during its construction to ensure its success and longevity. Similarly, construction superstitions that persist to this day among some workers, such as reluctance to be the last to leave a site or insistence on certain rituals at key project milestones, can be traced back to much older beliefs about the need to protect workers and structures through spiritual means. The comparison between historical foundational sacrifice legends and modern issues of worker safety in the construction industry offers disturbing parallels and important lessons. Although we obviously no longer deliberately bury people alive in building foundations, modern corporate decisions that prioritize profit over worker safety result in deaths that are just as real, even if not described in those terms. When construction companies cut costs on safety equipment, when regulations are poorly enforced, when workers are pressured to work in dangerous conditions to meet tight deadlines, the result is preventable worker deaths that are functionally equivalent to sacrifices, even if not labelled as such. The moral outrage we feel when contemplating the possibility of literal foundational sacrifices in the Middle Ages should lead us to critically examine modern practices that continue to treat workers' lives as acceptable costs rather than sacred values to be protected. Modern labour organisations and safety advocates often invoke the memory of workers who died on historical construction projects as a way to motivate ongoing improvements in safety standards. Monuments and memorials to workers killed on specific construction projects serve both to honour the dead and to remind current and future generations of the human costs of infrastructure development. These modern memorials can be seen as counterparts to historical foundational sacrifice legends, both recognizing that great structures are built not only with stone and mortar, but also with the sweat, blood, and sometimes lives of ordinary workers whose names and stories are often forgotten. Today, the preservation and study of medieval castles and other historical structures provide opportunities to educate the public not only about impressive architectural achievements, but also about the human realities of medieval construction. Museums and historic sites that incorporate interpretation about medieval builders' working conditions, the dangers they faced, and the legends that grew around these buildings provide valuable context that enriches our understanding and appreciation of these structures. By acknowledging both the technical triumphs and the human costs of medieval construction, we can develop a more nuanced and complete perspective on history. Modern digital technologies, including three-dimensional modeling, virtual reality, and computer reconstructions, allow historians and archaeologists to recreate medieval construction processes in ways that make visible the challenges and dangers that medieval workers faced. These educational tools can help contemporary audiences develop empathy for the workers who built the historic buildings we admire, and better understand the context in which foundational sacrifice legends arose and persisted. By virtually experiencing what it would be like to work on a medieval building site, modern observers can gain a deeper appreciation of why death was so common in these environments, and why stories of deliberate sacrifices might arise to explain or give meaning to these frequent tragedies. The ethics of studying and presenting information about foundational sacrifices and medieval worker deaths also deserve careful consideration. There is a balance to be struck between honestly acknowledging the brutal realities of the past and avoiding gratuitous sensationalism that treats human suffering as mere entertainment. Scholars and educators have a responsibility to present this information in ways that respect the dignity of the victims while providing accurate historical context and relevant lessons for the present. The exploration of foundational sacrifice legends in popular culture, including horror literature and films, raises questions about when the artistic use of dark historical themes becomes insensitive exploitation versus when it serves legitimate purposes of entertainment or social commentary. As we conclude this extensive exploration of medieval foundational sacrifice legends and the realities of castle construction, several important conclusions emerge. First, although definitive evidence of literal and systematic foundational sacrifices in Christian medieval Europe remains elusive and controversial, legends about such practices were widespread and persistent, suggesting that they reflected deep cultural beliefs about the relationship between sacrifice, construction, and structural durability. Second, regardless of whether deliberate sacrifices took place or not, the brutal reality is that thousands of workers died in accidents during the construction of castles, cathedrals, and other monumental medieval structures, making these buildings literally built with human lives. Third, medieval attitudes toward the lives of ordinary workers, shaped by feudal social structures and specific religious beliefs, allowed levels of danger and mortality that would be considered completely unacceptable by modern standards. Fourth, foundational sacrifice legends served multiple cultural functions, including providing supernatural explanations for the exceptional durability of buildings, symbolically acknowledging the human costs of monumental construction, and keeping pre-Christian spiritual traditions alive beneath a thin layer of official Christian culture. Fifth, elements of these ancient beliefs and practices persist in transformed forms to the present day, including groundbreaking rituals, worker superstitions, and the ongoing fascination with historical legends in popular culture. And finally, although we no longer deliberately bury people in building foundations, modern issues of worker safety in the construction industry echo similar themes of valuing buildings more than the lives of the people who build them, reminding us that history's lessons remain relevant to contemporary challenges. When you visit a medieval castle, cross an ancient bridge, or admire a historic cathedral, remember that these magnificent structures are not only triumphs of engineering and expressions of power or faith, but also involuntary monuments to countless ordinary workers whose hard work, skill, and sometimes lives made these constructions possible. Foundational sacrifice legends, whether based on literal practices or functioning as metaphorical acknowledgements, invite us to look beyond the superficial grandeur of these structures and contemplate the profound human costs of monumental construction. In doing so, we honour not only the architectural achievements of the past, but also the humanity of those who created them. And we commit ourselves to ensuring that construction work in the present and future does not demand similar sacrifices of human lives. Thank you for following this deep and disturbing exploration of one of the darkest legends of medieval history. If you learned something new or developed a new perspective on the castles and historic constructions we all admire, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel for more educational content about fascinating and often forgotten aspects of human history. Share this video with friends who appreciate history or architecture, because the stories of the workers who built our architectural heritage deserve to be remembered and told. Until the next video, keep exploring, questioning, and learning about the rich and complex past that has shaped our present.